Welcome to the channel. Today we drift into the frozen nightmare of the Soviet Gulag and uncover what life truly was behind the barbed wire. Please like, share, and subscribe for more history documentaries. Now, let's step into the story. Cold, silent, endless, those are the first words that come to mind when trying to grasp what life felt like for the millions of men and women who entered the Soviet Gulag system. Not just cold in the sense of winter, but a deeper cold, one that seeped into the bones, the heart, and finally the soul. It was the kind of cold that didn't merely surround you, it swallowed you. For those who endured it, the Gulag wasn't a single place. It was an entire hidden world, scattered across frozen forests, desolate tundra, remote mountain valleys, and wind-swept plains where the horizon seemed to stretch forever. Camps were built far from cities, deliberately invisible, placed where escape was nearly impossible, where nature itself appeared to conspire with the guards. Even if someone breached the barbed wire, what were they to run toward? Thousands of miles of wilderness lay between them and any semblance of civilization. The landscape became another prison wall. The Gulag system grew from fear, ideology, and an insatiable hunger for control. It emerged in the years following revolution, when paranoia spread through the government and suspicion became policy. Leaders believed enemies lurked everywhere, in factories, villages, offices, even among friends and family. And when fear becomes law, justice vanishes. Arrests happened quietly, sometimes in broad daylight, sometimes in the dead of night. A knock at the door, boots in the hallway, a commanding voice reading accusations drafted long before the accused ever saw them. People were told they were under investigation. Many still trusted in fairness. They believed they could explain, reason, defend their innocence. But the Gulag did not arise from reason. It arose from the belief that confession outweighed truth. Interrogations were relentless. Hours turned into days, days into weeks. Prisoners were stripped of sleep, food, and hope. Some confessed simply because they could no longer endure the pressure. Others signed anything just to end the torment. Sentences were often predetermined: years, 15, 20 fever, lifetime disguised in numbers. Families rarely received explanations. They were told to forget the name, forget the face, forget the person taken away. And in many cases, they had no choice. Once condemned, prisoners were moved to holding cells, waiting for transport. They watched the world through tiny barred windows, listening to footsteps echo through damp corridors. Rumors passed from cell to cell, where they'd be sent, how long they'd work, what the conditions might be, but rumors offered little comfort. Reality was always worse. Eventually, the day came. Guards shouted names, or rather numbers, and people were marched outside. They saw trucks, trains, convoys. Some carried small bundles, a piece of clothing, a book, perhaps a photograph. Others carried nothing. Snow crunched beneath their feet as they moved toward a journey that felt more like exile than imprisonment. The trains used for deportation were not built for people. They were meant for livestock or cargo. The cars were sealed, dark, and filthy. Iron doors slammed shut from the outside, locking prisoners into cramped spaces with barely any air. Wooden bunks lined the sides, though rarely enough for everyone. Those who arrived first claimed a spot. The rest stood leaning against one another as the train lurched forward. Sometimes the journey lasted days, sometimes weeks. There were no schedules, no explanations, just endless motion and the clatter of wheels on frozen rails. Inside the cars, the atmosphere soured quickly. The smell of sweat, fear, and unwashed bodies filled the air. Buckets in the corners served as toilets. When the train halted wherever it happened, two B-guards opened the doors for mere minutes so waste could be tossed out and a ladle of water passed around. Food consisted of thin soup, maybe a crust of stale bread, not enough to ease hunger, just enough to keep prisoners alive. During the long nights, people whispered. Some spoke of families, their work, the lives they'd left behind. Others wondered aloud whether they'd ever return home. But as days passed, voices grew quieter, energy faded. Every prisoner slowly learned the first essential lesson of the Gulag. Weakness was dangerous. Complaining drew attention. Asking questions angered guards. Showing vulnerability invited exploitation. Silence became a shield. Eventually, the train ground to a final halt. The doors opened to reveal barren wilderness, white snow stretching endlessly. Forests black with frost, rivers locked under ice. Guards shouted again, ordering men and women into lines. They marched, stiff and trembling, toward the camp. From a distance, the camps didn't look like much, just clusters of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire. But the barbed wire told the real story. Double fences, watchtowers, evenly spaced, each staffed by armed guards. Searchlights cast long beams across the snow. Even the footprints around the perimeter seemed afraid. The gate was heavy, ironclad. Many prisoners later said the sound it made, the echo of it closing behind them, was the moment they truly realized they'd entered another world. A world where laws existed, but not for them. A world in which survival itself was never guaranteed. Upon arrival, prisoners were processed like inventory. Names were recorded, then often replaced by numbers. The number mattered. The person did not. Personal belongings were confiscated: watches, wedding rings, letters. Objects once full of meaning became prohibited reminders of life before the camp. Prisoners were issued uniforms, worn coats, and boots already patched many times. Clothing rarely fit. Large boots filled with rags, coats too thin to block the wind. Gloves, if provided, were shared. Then came the barracks-long wooden structures, arranged in rows. Inside, the air felt stagnant, thick with smoke from stoves that never burned hot enough. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, slept in each building. Bunk beds, stacked 3 levels high, lined the walls. Those near the center stayed slightly warmer. Those near the edges felt every gust of wind seeping through cracks. On cold nights, frost formed on blankets, and prisoners awoke with icicles clinging to their eyelashes. The barracks teemed with noise, coughing, snoring, whispering, the creaking of beds, the scraping of boots. Yet beneath it all lay a deeper silence, the silence of despair. People lay awake, staring into darkness, thinking of lost homes, families left behind, years stretching forward with no end. Food rations were distributed by guards or overseers. Watery broth, a small lump of porridge, occasionally a piece of bread rationed by weight, cut carefully so no one received more than assigned. Bread was the most precious thing in camp. Prisoners protected it like treasure, hiding crumbs in pockets, eating slowly, to make it last. The daily routine began early. At first, light or often before guards blew whistles and shouted commands. Prisoners rushed to dress, fumbling with stiff, frozen clothing. They joined roll call outside, where frostbite gnawed at exposed skin. If someone had died during the night, which happened often, their body was still counted, propped upright so the quota would be met. The introduction to camp rules was simple but brutal. Disobedience meant punishment. Slowing down meant punishment. Asking questions meant punishment. The camp functioned on a system designed to crush individuality and enforce obedience through fear. Guards did not see prisoners as human beings. They saw them as expendable labor, parts of a machine built to extract resources from some of Earth's harshest environments. And yet, even during those first days, not everything was defined by cruelty. Within the barracks, prisoners sought fragments of humanity wherever they could. Older inmates explained how things worked, where to stand during roll call, how to fold blankets, how to stretch meager rations. A small gesture sharing half a piece of bread, offering space on a bunk could mean the difference between despair and faint hope. In a place meant to erase all compassion, the smallest kindness became an act of resistance. Fear, however, remained constant. The sound of guards' footsteps on gravel, the barking of dogs, a sudden shouted order, these sent immediate ripples through the camp. No one ever felt safe. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Eyes turned downward. People learned to speak without moving their lips, to communicate through nods and glances, always cautious for new arrivals. The hardest adjustment wasn't physical pain, hunger, or cold, though all were relentless. The hardest thing to endure was the realization that normal life was gone. Letters came rarely, if at all. News from the outside world was scarce. Many didn't even know whether their families believed they were alive. Days blurred into a gray haze. Time itself became strange, stretching endlessly forward, yet vanishing behind them as if swallowed by snow. Authorities claimed the camps were places of re-education. In truth, they were sites of exploitation, forced labor camps, where prisoners built railroads across frozen ground, chopped trees in sub-zero temperatures, and dug canals with tools barely more advanced than those used centuries earlier. This truth was whispered through the barracks as a warning to newcomers. The Gulag wasn't temporary punishment. It was a daily battle against exhaustion, weather, and the system itself. The psychological toll was immense. Many described the first week as the most dangerous, not because of guards, but because of despair. Those who believed they'd never make it simply gave up emotionally and physically. They stopped fighting to stay warm, stopped conserving strength, stopped hoping. The camp swallowed them quickly. Others clung to whatever reasons for living they could find: family, faith, memory, a promise made to themselves. They repeated names in their heads so they wouldn't forget. They imagined returning home even if it seemed impossible. They learned to adapt, not to accept the system as just, but to survive within it. Survival required understanding unwritten rules. Don't draw attention. Save your strength. Never show all your food at once. Be cautious in whom you trust. Avoid conflict unless necessary. Work just enough to avoid punishment, but not so hard you collapse. Every choice mattered. Every step carried risk. Despite the cruelty, humanity lingered like small embers struggling against the wind. Prisoners shared stories at night about childhoods, cities, fields, oceans they remembered. They spoke of music, food, laughter, normal things that felt almost unreal inside the camp. These memories weren't just nostalgia, they were anchors, tying them to an identity the system tried to erase. Even in this cold, controlled world, acts of quiet courage appeared. Someone smuggled scraps of paper to record the names of the dead. Someone carved religious symbols from wood, hiding them where only trusted eyes could see. Someone risked punishment to pass messages between barracks. Each act said the same silent thing: we existed, we mattered, we will not let this place erase us completely. The first days were a harsh initiation. Prisoners learned that suffering was routine, that hope had to be managed carefully. Too much hope could break you when reality struck back. Too little would extinguish your will to live. The Gulag forced people to balance between despair and determination, between obedience and quiet resistance. Those who endured the arrival phase entered the next stage, the long, grinding life of the camp itself. What awaited them was work, punishment, hunger, disease, and endless winter. Yet the memory of arrival lingered like a scar, that first realization that the outside world had vanished, that the system had swallowed them whole. It stayed with prisoners for years. The Gulag was many things: a prison, a labor camp, a weapon of political repression, and a monument to unchecked power. But above all, it was a warning carved not into stone, but into memory. It shows what happens when fear rules a nation, when leaders view their own people as threats, and when human lives become expendable tools in the pursuit of ideology. And for every person who walked through those gates, life split into two chapters. Before the Gulag, even those who survived would never fully escape the echoes of their arrival: the sound of barred gates closing, the wind slicing across open ground, the realization that the world behind them had disappeared into darkness, and that a different world, cold, silent, endless, had taken its place. The train slowed, then rattled forward again, as if unsure whether to stop or continue. For the prisoners inside, time had already lost its meaning. They tried counting hours by the intervals between guards, shouts, or by the rare moments when doors creaked open. But eventually, the rhythm of the journey blurred into one continuous ordeal. It felt as though the train wasn't just moving across the country, was carrying them out of the world they knew and into another reality entirely, one where nothing familiar remained. Inside each car, the air was thick and stale. Small barred vents near the ceiling offered little more than sharp blasts of winter. Breath condensed into clouds, then droplets, then frost clinging to the wood. Every movement scraped against something: metal chains, rough boards, boots on the floor. People shifted to relieve numbness in their legs, but there was nowhere to go. Bodies pressed together, strangers forced into intimacy, sharing warmth not out of kindness, but necessity. Some whispered quietly, others stared blankly at nothing. And there were those who tried to pray, mouthing words silently, afraid to be noticed. The train was a waiting room between fates, a place where every thought revolved around a single question: what awaits us at the end of this journey? From time to time, a guard slid open a small hatch and peered inside. His eyes swept the crowded car with an expression not of hatred, but something colder, indifference, the kind that comes when people stop seeing others as human beings. Orders were barked, sometimes for no reason, just to remind those inside who held power. A silence followed each shout, as if prisoners collectively inhaled and decided it was safer not to exhale too loudly. When night fell, darkness consumed everything. No lamps, no flickers of light, only faint outlines of faces and hands illuminated by reflected snow. When the train passed open land, sounds grew louder in the darkness, the steady clack of rails, the distant howl of wind, an occasional cough echoing longer than it should. Someone cried, once a young woman, her voice trembling with exhaustion. Another voice gently urged her to stop. Tears might attract attention, and attention could bring punishment. The smell inside the car changed as days passed. Hunger had a scented emptiness mixed with sweat, fear, and the sourness of unwashed bodies. Buckets in corners overflowed despite prisoners' efforts to keep order. When doors opened briefly at stations or outposts, the shock of fresh air stabbed into their lungs like knives, but it also brought brief relief. Some leaned as close as they dared to the opening, desperate to fill their lungs with clean, cold air before it vanished again. Guards shouted, and the doors slammed shut. Was rationed with ruthless precision a ladle of watery soup, a thin slice of bread. There were moments when a guard carelessly spilled a drop of soup onto the wood, and eyes followed that drop as though it were gold. A few brave souls licked crumbs from their palms. Others tucked half their bread inside their clothing, planning to save it for later, though everyone understood the risk. If discovered, it could be stolen, confiscated, or used as an excuse for punishment. Still, some held on anyway, because possessing food meant possessing a little control over life. During these long journeys, people learned things about themselves they never wanted to know. They discovered how long they could go without sleep, how deeply fear could embed itself beneath the skin, how easily the mind could drift toward despair. But they also discovered a strange, fragile resilience. They found they could keep standing even when their legs trembled. They learned how to share tiny scraps without being seen. They learned to listen without speaking, to comfort without drawing attention. When the train finally slowed again, more decisively, this time people sensed something had changed. The wheels screeched, sparks flew, and the whole car shuddered. Voices rose in hushed tones. Some strained toward the door, hoping to glimpse where they were. Others simply closed their eyes and whispered silent goodbyes to places and people they might never see again. The doors opened to a world of stark whiteness. Snow spread in every direction, broken only by dark tree lines and the rigid shapes of guard towers looming like sentinels. The air rushed in a cold so intense it made people gasp involuntarily. Guards shouted orders. Prisoners stumbled forward, blinking against the brightness. The sky seemed impossibly large, indifferent, endless. They were herded off the train and into lines. Some carried small bundles. Others clutched coats that barely shielded them from the wind. Their feet sank into snow up to their shins. The cold crept through fabric, through skin, finding every weakness. A few collapsed from exhaustion or shock and were dragged upright with little ceremony. The world here had no patience. Ahead, through blowing snow, the camp slowly revealed itself. Barbed wire fences formed hard boundaries around crude wooden structures. Watchtowers stood at each corner, guards silhouetted inside with rifles in hand. Dogs barked, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Somewhere nearby, metal clanged against metal, a reminder that work, constant and relentless, was the purpose of this place. As prisoners approached the gate, the symbolism struck with full force. It wasn't just an entrance, it was a threshold, a line between one existence and another. Many felt that whatever identity they'd brought, teacher, farmer, student, parent, soldier, would not survive beyond that gate. The system didn't care who they were before. It cared only what they could endure now. The gate creaked open, and prisoners shuffled inside. That creak became a sound they'd never forget, an echo in memory, like a warning bell announcing the old world had officially ended. Beyond the gate, guards directed them to a makeshift processing area. Forms were filled out, names checked, mistakes made and rarely corrected. Then, almost casually, numbers were assigned, a number on a tag, a number on a list, a number that would replace their name in conversations, punishments, and records. Personal belongings were confiscated with near scientific detachment. Rings slipped off swollen fingers. Photographs were glanced at for a second, then tossed aside as if meaningless. A scarf knitted by a mother, a Bible, a notebook of poems, all labeled contraband or unnecessary. With each item taken, prisoners felt parts of themselves stripped away, as though being reduced to something simpler, something easier to control. Uniforms were issued next, thin coats with missing buttons, trousers patched so many times that the original fabric was barely visible. Boots were several sizes too big or painfully small. Prisoners stuffed rags into shoes to keep them on. Some rolled up sleeves that drooped past their hands. None of it mattered. The clothing wasn't meant for comfort, it was meant for uniformity. They were guided to the barracks, trudging through snow paths carved by countless feet before them. Inside, the smell of damp wood and smoke filled their nostrils. Heat from small iron stoves barely reached the corners. Bunks were assigned quickly. Top bunks were cold. Bottom bunks were damp. Middle bunks were a blessing by comparison. Blankets were thin and reeked of age. People sat on their assigned beds, unsure whether to feel relief the journey had ended or terror something worse was beginning. For many, the first shock wasn't the harshness of conditions, but the realization there was no clear end in sight. The rattle of the train had at least suggested movement. Here, everything felt frozen: time, landscape, fate, outside, snowdrifts, piled against walls. Inside, people huddled around the stove, stretching hands toward flames that barely warmed their palms. That first night was unlike any other. Sleep didn't come easily. Some cried quietly, faces buried so guards wouldn't see. Others lay motionless, staring into darkness, replaying every event that led them there. Some still believed a mistake had been made, that someone, somewhere, would correct it. And there were those who already understood the truth. Mistakes were seldom corrected here. The next morning, reality arrived long before dawn. A whistle blew sharp and shrill. Commands echoed across the yard. Prisoners scrambled from bunks, movements clumsy with exhaustion. They rushed to dress, pulling on stiff boots and frozen jackets. Outside, wind lashed their faces. One by one, they assembled for roll call, standing in straight lines as guards paced, counting, recounting, shouting if anyone moved. If a prisoner had died during the night, their body didn't leave the line. It was propped upright against another prisoner or simply left standing, frozen in the same position it had taken in death. The system cared more about numbers than lives. Prisoners watched, numb with horror, as the reality of their new existence settled over them like another layer of frost. The introduction to camp life continued with brutally simple instructions: obey, work, do not question. Punishments were explained not as threats, but as facts: isolation cells, reduced rations, extra labor, beatings. The tone was clinical, almost bourgeois, if these were ordinary administrative details. And perhaps, in the logic of the camp, they were. Yet, amid the shock and fear, something unexpected appeared: patterns of quiet adaptation. Older prisoners who had survived months or years began offering whispered advice to newcomers. Stand where the wind is weakest during roll call. Wrap cloth around your hands beneath your gloves. Hide half your bread immediately and eat the other half slowly. Never be the first to volunteer. Never be the last to move when ordered. These tips weren't meant to inspire courage. They were meant to increase the odds of survival by a fraction. During rare rest moments inside the barracks, new arrivals listened. They heard stories about quotas, work sites far beyond camp punishments, and rare privileges. They learned which guards could be reasoned with and which seemed to enjoy cruelty. They listened because listening meant learning. Learning meant living. As days passed, initial shock transformed into a heavy, persistent awareness. The camp was not temporary. It was not a brief stop on the way to justice. It was a world with its own rules, rhythms, and brutal hierarchy. Prisoners began to recognize familiar faces: the guard who never smiled, the old prisoner who shuffled, the criminal inmate always near the food line. Slowly, painfully, the unfamiliar became routine, but the emotional wound of arrival, of being processed, stripped, numbered, and contained, never quite healed. It became part of every prisoner's story, a memory that lived beneath every experience that followed. When newcomers arrived in the future, those who had already endured their own arrival felt something shift inside them. They saw themselves reflected in frightened eyes, and in that reflection lay a terrible realization. This cycle would continue over and over, as long as the system demanded more labor, more bodies, more silence. So prisoners learned to carry on, not because they accepted the injustice, but because survival demanded it. They worked, they waited, they endured relentless cold and the constant feeling of being watched. They told themselves small stories, made small promises, found small reasons to wake each day. Somewhere in the distance, life outside continued, unreachable, almost unimaginable. And all the while, the memory of those first days, the train, the gate, the shock of the wind, the loss of identity remained etched into their minds. It marked the point where their old lives ended and their struggle in the Gulag truly began. It was the moment they stepped not into a prison with walls and cells, but into a complete system designed to reshape them, to diminish them, and above all to remind them that in this frozen world, weakness was dangerous, hope was fragile, and survival was never guaranteed. The first night in the barracks was a lesson in the hierarchy of survival. New arrivals were shoved toward the worst bunk's lower boards, near the drafty door or damp corners where snowmelt sometimes seeped through. Upper bunks, closer to what little warmth drifted upward, were already claimed by veterans prisoners who'd learned how to negotiate favors, steal unnoticed, or curry favor with guards and foremen. These men weren't necessarily stronger. They were simply more adapted to the cruel mathematics of the Gulag. Space, food, warmth, protection. Everything had a price, and everything could be traded. The barracks reeked of sweat, unwashed clothing, and the sour odor of thin cabbage soup soaked into the wood from countless spilled bowls. A single iron stove stood in the center, glowing faintly not to warm anyone, but to maintain the illusion of heat, a symbol rather than a solution. In winter, ice sometimes formed on the inside walls. Prisoners woke with frost on their eyelashes, breath freezing in pale clouds. Sleep itself was never truly restful. Men coughed, muttered, cried out in nightmares, or tossed restlessly from hunger aches gnawing at their stomachs. Rats scurried across the floor, and occasionally over bodies, too weak to brush them away. There were always whispers trades being negotiated, secrets shared, rumors about inspections or punishment brigades somewhere in the dark. Someone counted every crumb of saved bread, terrified of being robbed before morning. Food was the defining measure of existence. Officially, prisoners received rations. In reality, rations were a form of discipline. Work harder, fulfill the impossible quota, and maybe you'd get a few extra grams of bread. Fail to meet the quota, fall behind, collapsing the ration shrank. Less bread meant weaker bodies. Weaker bodies meant falling further behind. Eventually, the system consumed those who could no longer feed it. The morning meal was usually nothing more than thin gruel floating with a few sad pieces of barley husk or boiled weeds. Bread was black, heavy, sometimes filled with sawdust to stretch the flour. Men treasured it like treasure. Prisoners divided their ration with near scientific precision. Some devoured it immediately, unable to resist. Others wrapped their portion in scraps of cloth, tucking it under their shirt or even inside their boots, saving it for the moment despair hit hardest. But saving bread was dangerous. Someone always watched, always calculated, always waited for the right time to steal. Work began before sunrise. Guards marched prisoners out in columns, boots crunching across ice or sinking into mud, depending on the season. Guards were usually poorly trained conscripts, hardened not by principle but by bitterness. Many were barely older than the prisoners. They oversaw, yet the uniform gave them license to treat human beings as livestock. Insults, shoves, and beatings were constant. Prisoners were numbers, not names. A man could disappear, and his absence would barely ripple across the frozen horizon. The work itself varied: logging in forests, digging canals, hauling stone, building railways through wilderness, mining in permafrost. Tasks were deliberately brutal, designed less for efficiency and more for punishment. Tools were rudimentary: dull saws, splintered shovels, axes with loose heads. Gloves were rare, coats threadbare. Frostbitten fingers cracked and bled. Toes blackened and died unnoticed until the stench gave them away. Each man was tied to a quota too. A number scrawled on a clipboard by an indifferent foreman. Cut this many logs, move this many cubic meters of earth, shaft, this much coal. Failure wasn't simply reprimanded, meant less food. Less food meant death, slowly approaching, each day drawing closer. There was something terrifyingly mathematical about it. Survival became a calculation, a race against a number that never cared who you were or what you'd once been. Among prisoners, different groups formed naturally. There were political prisoners, teachers, doctors, engineers, writers, peasants, who'd resisted grain requisitions, men who'd made offhand jokes or been accused by someone desperate to save themselves. Many still carried themselves with dignity, as if clinging to former lives gave meaning to present suffering. Beside them were hardened criminals, thieves, bandits, repeat offenders. These men often dominated the barracks, controlling trade and intimidation like a shadow government sanctioned by guards. In many camps, guards deliberately empowered them, using them as tools to keep the rest in check. This internal class war bred tension. Political prisoners spoke quietly among themselves, debating ideology, remembering books, reciting poetry from memory like sacred texts. The criminals laughed at them. In the harsh ecosystem of the Gulag, principles were luxuries, everything not directly tied to tea. Immediate survival seemed naive, yet even in the most desperate circumstances, moments of humanity somehow persisted. When someone collapsed during work, another prisoner sometimes risked losing rations to help him stand. A stolen potato might be split 3 ways. A scrap of newspaper smuggled from somewhere could become a treasure. Read and reread until the paper dissolved. At night, someone might recount stories of home describing ordinary meals, family gatherings, warm kitchens in such vivid detail that listeners could almost feel the warmth until the reality of the barracks returned. Punishment was always nearby. Infractions, real or imagined, led to solitary confinement, grimly known as the box. Prisoners inside were barely given food, almost no clothing, and had to endure bitter cold or suffocating heat, depending on the season. Some returned broken, others never returned at all. Rumors circulated constantly about men taken for questioning and vanishing forever. Sickness swept through camp like a shadow. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, thriving amid malnutrition and filth. Medical facilities, if they existed, were primitive. Prison doctors, often prisoners themselves, could do little more than offer advice and scraps of medicine. The so-called hospital provided one temporary benefit: reduced work. But beds were few and access highly controlled. Some prisoners feigned illness, hoping for brief respite. Others hid symptoms, afraid they'd be marked as useless and discarded. As seasons changed, the landscape itself seemed to conspire against those trapped within it. In winter, the land froze into an endless white desert. In summer, swarms of mosquitoes filled the air, biting through thin clothing and leaving raw welts. Mud swallowed boots. The sun barely set, eroding any sense of time. Every day blurred into the next: the march, the labor, the thin soup, the cold nights, the constant fear. Despite everything, there were those who refused to surrender their inner world. Men composed imaginary letters to loved ones, repeating the words silently to preserve memory. Others carved tiny figures from wood scraps. Some prayed even when faith itself could be considered rebellion. They clung to hope, fragile, flickering, that the outside world still existed, that someone somewhere remembered their name. Yet, for many, the camp reshaped reality. New prisoners arrived exhausted and stunned, repeating the same questions. How long will this last? Will anyone ever leave? The older inmates rarely answered directly. They simply shrugged as if time had lost meaning. Sentences of 5, 10, or 20 years were abstractions, overshadowed by the daily battle against hunger and cold. For some, the Gulag had become their only world, a world governed not by law, but by fear, numbers, and scarcity. At night, when guards locked the barracks and the murmur of voices slowly faded, there were moments of eerie stillness, moments when the weight of everything pressed down, and the only sound was the wind scraping against the walls, carrying with it the ghosts of those who hadn't made it, and the silent resolve of those who still tried. Silence. The vast Siberian wilderness stretched in every direction, endless forests, frozen rivers, mountains distant and indifferent. Escape was theoretically possible. Practically, it meant death by exposure, starvation, or wolves long before reaching any sign of civilization. Stories circulated about those who tried, bodies found frozen in the snow, footprints disappearing into the forest, never seen again. Hope, when misapplied, could be fatal. Even so, the human mind sought meaning. Some prisoners told themselves they were witnesses to history, that enduring this ordeal meant participating in something larger, even if that something was monstrous. Others withdrew into numbness, shutting down feelings to survive another day without breaking. Life in the camp was not one dramatic event followed by another. Rather, it was an accumulation of small degradations, the hunger pang that became normal, the beating that went unremembered, the friend who grew quieter each day and then simply wasn't there one morning. These little losses formed the rhythm of existence, as relentless as the sound of saws biting into frozen timber, and through it all, the Gulag system continued to function like a vast machine, indifferent and self-sustaining. Trains kept arriving, quotas kept rising, reports were filed, statistics compiled, and somewhere far away, officials congratulated themselves on productivity numbers. While men froze in forests they would never leave, for the prisoners living inside, this reality, survival hinged on a delicate balance, protecting one's ration, avoiding unnecessary attention, forging quiet alliances, and preserving some fragment of self. Every day was a negotiation. How far to bend without breaking, how much to endure without losing the will to live. And for many, the quiet realization grew. The Gulag wasn't just a place of confinement. It was a deliberate experiment in crushing the human spirit to see how much suffering a person could endure before forgetting who they had once been. The longer a prisoner stayed in the camp, the more they understood that punishment wasn't merely a response to disobedience. It was a language, a system of signals meant to remind everyone that they were owned. It was the invisible hand-shaping behavior, forcing obedience even when the guards weren't looking. Every gesture, every tone of voice, every delay in stepping into formation could be interpreted as defiance. And defiance, whether imagined or real, required demonstration. Someone had to pay phonely to keep everyone else afraid. The punishments varied, sometimes arbitrary, sometimes ritualized. A prisoner might be ordered to stand for hours in the bitter cold without gloves or hat, as winds sliced across their face like tiny knives. Another might be forced to dig a pit only to fill it back in, repeating the senseless task until their muscles trembled. There was no logic except subjugation, no purpose except to erode the idea that effort should lead to meaning. In the Gulag, exhaustion itself became a sentence. Then there was the punishment. Brigada workgroup assigned impossible quotas with intentionally inadequate tools. Men sent there were practically being signed over to slow execution. Their bodies wasted faster, their rations shrank quicker, their names faded sooner. One could see it in their eyes, the dullness, the resignation, the way hope slipped away, like breath in cold air. Sometimes they marched back from work as a skeletal line, missing one or two faces that had fallen in the snow and simply been swallowed by silence. What terrified prisoners most was not always the brutality, but the randomness. One day, a guard might joke with a prisoner, accepting a cigarette or tolerating a minor mistake. The next day, that same guard would beat someone senseless for no clear reason at all. The message was clear. Nothing was predictable and, therefore, nothing was safe. You could follow every rule and still find yourself dragged to the commandant's office, accused of laziness, sabotage, or disrespect, words that could reshape your fate overnight. Inside that small office, beneath portraits of distant leaders, whose names the prisoners whispered with weary bitterness, everything depended on the moods of men who had long ceased to see prisoners as human beings. Signed papers meant additional years. Silence or sarcasm could be interpreted however officials wished. There was rarely any defense worth giving. The accusation was already the verdict. All that remained was the degree of suffering attached. The solitary cell remained one of the most feared punishments. The box, often built of thin planks with cracks that let in wind and insects, felt like a coffin turned upright. There was barely enough room to sit. At night, cold seeped into bone. Prisoners counted hours by their own breath. Some tried to recite memories, songs, or prayers, clinging desperately to words so they wouldn't unravel. Others scratched marks into the wood, inventing calendars that quickly dissolved into confusion. Time in the box stretched into something monstrous, neither day nor night, neither full consciousness nor sleep. And when prisoners emerged, blinking back into the world of barracks and labor lines, even suffering among others felt strangely like relief. The guards understood the value of humiliation as well. Public punishment wasn't only about the victim, it was theater. They lined up prisoners to witness beatings, forcing them to stand still while blows fell. Each crack of the baton sent a shiver of dread through the entire group. "This could be you," the spectacle whispered. "This could be any of you at any moment." Sometimes the victim was guilty of an infraction. Sometimes they were simply unlucky enough to be chosen as the example of the weak. It was during those moments that the psychological divide among prisoners became easiest to see. Some stared fixedly at the ground, willing themselves not to show emotion, anger, pity, disgust. Any visible reaction could be interpreted as solidarity and lead to punishment. Others watched everything closely, calculating, studying which guards were cruelest, which prisoners broke, and which endured. Some criminals smirked, quietly pleased when political prisoners were humiliated. In their eyes, it reaffirmed their place. In the upside-down world of the camps, brutality could be a form of currency, Yet beneath the layers of manipulation and fear, there still existed a fragile, almost secret economy of resistance, not the loud kind that slogans celebrate, but the quiet, stubborn kind that survives simply by refusing to vanish internally. Resistance might mean sharing a warning about an upcoming inspection. It could mean hiding a sick comrade during roll call so he might slip into the infirmary later. Sometimes it meant nothing. Yet beneath the layers of manipulation and fear, there still existed a fragile, almost secret economy of resistance, not the loud kind that slogans celebrate, but the quiet, stubborn kind that survives simply by refusing to vanish internally. Resistance might mean sharing a warning about an upcoming inspection. It could mean hiding a sick comrade during roll call so he might slip into the infirmary later. Sometimes it meant nothing more than refusing to laugh when the guards demanded amusement, a silent assertion that even humiliation had limits. Those who carried stories inside them became important. The professors, novelists, teachers, or priests, they became living libraries. At night, in voices barely above whispers, they reconstructed novels from memory, recited entire chapters, debated philosophical questions, or told histories that the regime tried to erase. For a few minutes at a time, men seated on rough wooden boards traveled far beyond barbed wire to cities they had never seen, to ancient battles, to fictional worlds. This mental escape did not change rations or erase cold, but it strengthened something intangible, the sense that there was still a world beyond the camp, still a life worth remembering. Not everyone appreciated such conversations. Some prisoners dismissed them as fantasies, distractions that dulled the sharp edge of survival. One thief famously snarled that stories could not be traded for bread, and he was right in a brutally practical sense. But he failed to see that, without such fragile illusions, the soul risked starving faster than the body. Letters, when they occasionally arrived, were both blessing and torment. Censors blacked out entire phrases, leaving jagged scars of ink across sentences. A short message might take months to reach the camp, and even longer for a reply to leave. Sometimes, news of a death at home arrived too late for grief to find context. Other times, a letter spoke of children growing up, of fields changing with seasons, of a life continuing without the prisoner. These reminders could weaken a manner. They could steady him, giving meaning to every day endured. The cruelest fate belonged to those who received nothing at all. Silence could crush a person more thoroughly than punishment ever could. There were moments when morale across the camp dipped collectively, as if everyone felt an invisible pressure at once. A particularly brutal winter, a new commandant with a reputation for cruelty, rumors of war, losses, or political purges beyond the fences. On such days, the atmosphere thickened, conversations shortened, faces tightened. Men trudged through routines, not out of hope, but out of inertia. Survival became mechanical, one foot, one step, one shallow breath after another. Death rarely arrived dramatically. It came quietly, slipping unnoticed into tired bodies. A prisoner might cough persistently one week, grow weaker the next, and then one morning failed to rise from his bunk. Those around him lifted his thin form carefully, not out of ceremony, but out of a weary understanding that the dead deserved at least minimal dignity. The camp had routines for such things, a number recorded, a blanket wrapped, a brief gap in the roll before labor resumed. Sometimes someone murmured a prayer. Sometimes silence was the only farewell. The cruel irony was that the Gulag depended on the very people it destroyed. The system consumed lives to build railways, dams, mines, monuments that later generations might pass without knowing the human cost buried beneath the foundations. For the authorities, prisoners became statistics, productivity reports, quotas achieved. For the men who endured the work, those same projects were scars across the landscape, reminders that their suffering had been transformed into cold infrastructure. Relationships within the camp were volatile and complicated. Friendships formed unexpectedly, two men from entirely different worlds, discovering a shared love of music, a similar childhood memory, or simply recognizing a familiar loneliness in one another. But friendship was risky. Attachments invited pain when death or transfers inevitably took someone away. Still, some held on to these fragile bonds because they made them feel human again. Trust, however, was always dangerous. Informants existed everywhere, prisoners who traded secrets for favors, reduced sentences, or scraps of extra food. The threat of betrayal hovered constantly, poisoning conversations. A casual remark about a guard, an expression of bitterness, a whispered complaint, any of these could end up quoted in an interrogation room. And yet, despite the risk, people spoke anyway. To stay completely silent for years was its own form of madness. Some prisoners turned inward, constructing elaborate inner lives. They built imaginary houses, furnished them in their thoughts, invited remembered loved ones to sit by non-existent fireplaces. Others replayed old arguments or conversations, trying to rewrite outcomes in their minds. A few, exhausted by hope and memory, surrendered to apathy, walking through each day like a ghost, neither resisting nor fully participating. These were often the ones who vanished first, not necessarily physically, but psychologically. Their eyes lost focus. Their voices became monotone. They were present, yet already gone. Religion, though officially condemned, never fully disappeared. Men carved makeshift crosses, whispered forbidden prayers, or improvised ceremonies for the dead. Some believed that suffering purified the soul. Others questioned a universe that allowed such cruelty. In the hush before lights out, quiet murmurs sometimes rippled through the barracks, not defiant, not loud, but steady, like the last embers of a fire refusing to die. Occasionally, rumors of amnesty or shorter sentences would surge through the camp like a sudden, strong wind. Prisoners clung to them desperately, analyzing every whispered detail, constructing elaborate timelines in their minds. Days later, when the rumors dissolved into nothing, the collapse of hope felt physically painful. And yet, within weeks, another rumor would take its place. Hope, even false hope, was addictive. The guards themselves were not all identical. Some were truly cruel men who seemed to derive pleasure from pain, whose eyes hardened at the sight of weakness. Others were simply trapped in their roles, afraid to show leniency because leniency could be seen as ideological weakness. A rare few occasionally slipped an extra ladle of soup to a sick prisoner or pretended not to notice a minor infraction. The system did not encourage kindness, but neither could it erase every trace of humanity. Still, prisoners learned never to rely on it. Mercy, when it came, was unpredictable. As seasons turned again, the rhythms of punishment, work, and fear threaded themselves into an almost unbearable normality. Men accustomed themselves to constant vigilance, checking every word and movement, measuring distance from guards, weighing every decision on a scale that balanced survival against self. It was a slow erosion, the kind that didn't break people in one dramatic moment, but wore them down grain by grain. And beneath it all lay a question that haunted almost everyone. Who will I be if I survive this? Some feared they would emerge, hardened, unable to love or trust. Others worried the world outside would move on, and the Gulag would vanish into a vague memory, leaving no trace of those who never returned. A few nurtured the opposite dream that one day truth would matter, and stories like theirs would finally be told instead of buried beneath propaganda and silence. Until then, they endured one endless day after another, carrying the invisible scars of punishment, marks not always left on skin, but carved deep into the mind, and far beyond the fences, in towns and cities, where ordinary life continued. Most people had no idea of the universe of suffering hidden in the remote wilderness, a place where time slowed, names disappeared, and the value of a human being could be measured in grams of bread and hours worked in freezing wind. Yet even there, in what seemed like the darkest corners of history, something fragile persisted, a quiet refusal to fully surrender the inner self. The camp could break bodies, humiliate, starve, and crush, but it struggled to erase entirely the stubborn spark that whispered, "You are more than this, remember." And that whispered memory, fragile, flickering, sometimes barely there, at all became the thin line separating those who merely existed from those who still, in spite of everything, somehow lived. By the time months slid into years, something began to shift inside the prisoners, not in a sudden revelation, but in a slow accumulation of thoughts that returned again and again like a tide. The question was no longer simply how to survive the next day, but what survival would even mean. A man could endure hunger, cold, humiliation, and fear, but what would be left afterward? Would the world outside recognize him, or worse, would he recognize himself? There were moments when prisoners tried to remember their old lives and found the images fading like photographs left too long in the sun. A teacher tried to recall his classroom, but his students' faces dissolved into vague outlines. A musician hummed fragments of melodies, but could not remember entire songs. A father pictured his children, yet the children grew older in dreams, faster than in memory. The camp had a way of stealing not only time, but identity, eroding the past slowly until it felt unreal. Yet it was precisely because of this erosion that many men clung desperately to ritual. Even the smallest personal habit, washing one's face with a handful of snow, folding a blanket neatly, whispering the same thought every morning, became a thread tying them to who they once were. These rituals did not change their conditions. They changed how they faced them. They were declarations. Yet it was precisely because of this erosion that many men clung desperately to ritual. Even the smallest personal habit, washing one's face with a handful of snow, folding a blanket neatly, whispering the same thought every morning, became a thread tying them to who they once were. These rituals did not change their conditions. They changed how they faced them. They were declarations, quiet and stubborn, I am still a person. Hope arrived in strange forms. Sometimes it was nothing more than a rumor carried from camp to camp, a change in leadership, whispers of amnesty, the possibility of sentence reductions. These rumors fluttered like fragile birds, often crushed quickly by reality. But for a short while they warmed conversations. Men discussed future plans with cautious excitement, what they would eat first, whom they would visit, where they might live. Then, when the rumors faded, disappointment washed over them like a cold wave. The pain of crushed hope could feel worse than the steady dullness of despair. But hope tied to distant promises proved unreliable. So many prisoners gradually learned to look inward instead. They began to find meaning not in future fantasies, but in the daily decision not to surrender completely. Surviving became less about waiting for rescue and more about preserving dignity in small choices, refusing to betray a friend, sharing a secret smile, remaining honest even when dishonesty might bring advantage. In this way, ethics themselves became acts of resistance. There were those who dreamed of escape. The wilderness seemed endless but brutally seductive forests, stretching beyond sight, rivers cutting through frozen plains, mountains rising like barriers carved by nature itself. Men spoke in hushed tones about maps they imagined or remembered, about villages far beyond the fences where someone might give bread, shelter, directions. Stories circulated about escapees, one who supposedly reached the border, another who disguised himself as a guard, a third who walked for months. No one could confirm whether these stories were true. They became legends, half warning, half inspiration. Most prisoners knew the odds. The land itself was a prison. Snow erased tracks. Rivers froze treacherously. Wolves prowled, though hunger was often a greater predator. Even in summer, swamps swallowed feet. Mosquitoes drained strength. To escape meant gambling not only with guards and dogs, but with nature. Many concluded silently that death beyond the fence was no different than death within, except that it would come alone. And yet, every so often, someone tried anyway, driven by a refusal so fierce that even certainty of failure could not extinguish it. Those left behind reacted with complex emotions when an escape attempt occurred. Some admired the courage. Others called it foolishness, especially if punishments followed. The guards always responded aggressively, increased inspections, harsher quotas, reduced rations. Collective punishment reminded everyone that freedom, even attempted freedom, came at a communal cost. So escape became both symbol and burden simultaneously, a source of pride and quiet resentment. As years passed, certain prisoners began to develop an uncanny sense of emotional distance. They spoke less about home, as if protecting themselves from the sharp sting of nostalgia. They stopped marking seasonal changes in their minds. Winter was simply colder work. Summer merely different hardships. Birthdays went uncounted. Anniversaries slipped away. Life collapsed into a loop of identical days, and the loop became their world. Yet for others, memory intensified instead of fading. They mentally replayed every family meal, every childhood street, the sound of particular footsteps in the hallway of their old house. They remembered the smell of bread, the creak of old furniture, the voices of neighbors. These memories grew sharp, almost painfully vivid, as if they feared that letting one detail slip would mean losing everything. At night, they visited familiar places in dreams, walking through streets that no longer existed, or sitting at tables that had long been sold or destroyed. They returned from those dreams with tears dried into their cheeks, embarrassed but unable to stop letters. For those who still received them, became sacred relics. They were folded and unfolded until the paper thinned, read until the words nearly disappeared. Even censored messages carried emotion between the lines. A single phrase like "we are managing" or "we think of you often" had layers of meaning. Sometimes prisoners traced those words with their fingers as if touch could bridge distance. When letters stopped coming, men constructed explanations, postal delays, bureaucratic errors, anything to avoid the darker possibility that they had simply been forgotten. The camp also shaped how prisoners viewed one another. At first, differences in background matter: the professor, the farmer, the soldier, the thief. But after enough winters, labels lost importance. Suffering stripped away illusions, revealing core traits: who could be trusted, who would steal, who would help others, who would harden into cruelty. Paradoxically, the Gulag both crushed individuality and exposed it. Under pressure, true character emerged, sometimes in astonishing ways. There were stories of generosity that seemed impossible in such conditions. A prisoner with a fever might awaken to find an extra scrap of bread tucked beneath his coat, anonymous, unclaimed. Another might discover that someone had quietly taken his shift carrying water. Once, a man who had saved his bread for days gave half away to someone who was clearly dying, knowing it made little logical sense. These gestures were small rebellions against a system designed to pit everyone against one another. Of course, not all acts were noble. Theft remained constant. Betrayal happened frequently, sometimes out of malice, more often out of desperation. Informants whispered names. Arguments erupted violently. Men who might once have lived ordinary, decent lives found themselves capable of acts they never would have imagined. Later, those who survived would carry an additional weight: not only the memory of harm done to them, but the guilt of what they had done to others in the name of survival. Religion and belief underwent transformation in the camp. Some lost faith, entirely convinced that any world capable of such cruelty could not possibly contain justice or compassion. Others experienced the opposite. Their belief deepened, stripped of ceremony, and reduced to simple, intimate conversations with the divine. A quiet prayer whispered in the cold night, a cross traced invisibly on the chest, a psalm recited from memory. These became lifelines. Faith did not always promise rescue. Instead, it promised meaning, and sometimes meaning was enough. In rare moments, when tensions eased slightly, laughter resurfaced, brittle at first, then surprisingly warm. Prisoners told jokes about bureaucracy, about guards, even about themselves. Humor became a way of taking control, if only for a few seconds. A clever story, shared quietly beneath a blanket, could transform fear into something temporarily manageable. The ability to laugh at absurdity, to see the system's contradictions, its exaggerated rituals, became another survival tool. There were also intellectual refuges. A scientist lectured about astronomy using pebbles in the dirt to represent planets. A historian retold entire wars from memory. A poet composed verses silently and recited them during breaks, the words floating like fragile sparks across the icy air. These activities might have looked pointless from the outside. Yet, inside the camp, they preserved the essential truth that human beings are more than laboring bodies. They reminded prisoners that knowledge, imagination, and creativity were realms untouched by barbed wire. The notion of time itself took on different meaning. Outside the camp, time moved forwards, seasonal harvests, birthdays, elections, storms passing, children growing. Inside, time often circled, the same routine repeated until days blended into one long present. When someone mentioned that 5 years had passed, it felt unreal, as though the number belonged to another person's story. Some prisoners intentionally forgot how long they had been there, believing that counting would break them. Others etched small marks into hidden surfaces, insisting on bearing witness to every lost day. A deep exhaustion also settled in, not just physical exhaustion, but existential fatigue, the kind that made thinking feel heavy. Men sat in silence for hours, staring into space, not because they had nothing to say, but because words themselves seemed depleted. The only cure for such exhaustion was rest. But true rest did not exist in the camp. Sleep was crowded and cold, filled with interruptions. Dreams were often disturbing, replaying arrests or imagining scenes of freedom that dissolved upon waking like mist. Still, through cycles of hope and despair, one idea refused to die entirely: that someday, somehow, the truth would matter. It was a quiet belief, rarely spoken aloud. Many feared punishment, even for entertaining it. Yet, in the back of their minds, prisoners imagined a future world where people would read, listen, and finally understand what had happened in these remote camps. They pictured historians uncovering documents, children learning the names of forgotten prisoners, monuments rising over burial grounds. They imagined testimonies being told not in whispers, but openly. For some, this imagined future became a substitute for personal justice. Even if they never saw freedom themselves, maybe their suffering would not disappear entirely into silence. There were moments when the outside world seemed to intrude unexpectedly, reminding everyone that history continued beyond the fences. Guards spoke quietly about battles, political changes, new leaders, sometimes rumors of war. Prisoners realized that although their world felt frozen, it was, in fact, fragile, ruled by decisions made by people who had never seen the camps at all. For those whose sentences neared their official end, anxiety intensified rather than easing. What awaited them beyond the gate? Would they be allowed to return home, or simply sent into permanent exile in the same remote region? Would their families accept them, or had years of propaganda turned loved ones into strangers? Some feared freedom as much as they longed for it. They had grown accustomed to structure, even cruel structure, and the open world, with its endless choices, seemed overwhelming. Others, especially those with impossibly long sentences or additional charges, faced an entirely different emotional challenge. They had to construct meaning within confinement itself, convincing themselves that life could still hold value even without the prospect of release. This required a kind of philosophical courage, the courage to live for reasons beyond reward. And then, occasionally, something extraordinary happened. Someone was actually released. The news always spread fast. Men gathered quietly after roll call, discussing every detail. What did he say? Was he thin, sick, changed? Did he believe the freedom was real or just another transfer? Had the guards treated him differently during his final days? The departure of one man jolted the psychological structure of the entire barracks. Suddenly, freedom was not only an idea, had a face, a name, a recent memory. Those who left often promised to write, to tell others, to remember. Some likely did. Others, exhausted or fearful, may have remained silent once they reached the outside world. But the possibility that someone walked beyond the fence, stepping onto soil without a guard behind him, rekindled something unspoken in everyone else. The camp continued its rhythm: dawn, roll call, labor, thin soup, exhaustion, night. But under that rhythm pulsed the complexity of human resilience, the quiet strategies, the internal monologues, the fragile loyalties, the secret hopes, and unspoken fears. The Gulag system aimed to transform living people into replaceable parts of a machine, but it could never fully erase the internal landscapes that each person carried. And that, perhaps, became the greatest paradox. Even as the prisoners' bodies weakened and their freedoms vanished, their minds, battered but unbroken, continued to travel beyond the fence. They dreamed, remembered, analyzed, imagined, feared, loved, doubted, believed. The system controlled their movements, but could only imperfectly control their thoughts. In that fragile, flickering territory, the quiet space inside the human spirit, where meaning is decided, the prisoners carved out the one realm the Gulag could never fully conquer. When the day finally came, or rather when it seemed to come, it arrived without ceremony. A guard called a name during roll call, as casually as he might announce a shift change. The prisoner whose name was spoken froze for a moment. He had heard enough rumors to know that a name could mean anything: transfer, punishment, or, against all odds, release. His heart hammered, not with hope, but with the ancient instinct to brace for whatever came next. Around him, the world held its breath, not because freedom had come, but because the fragile routine had been interrupted, however briefly, by the ghost of possibility.